Simpson to the Keen on Yoga podcast. Lovely to have you, Daniel.
Thank you for inviting me back, Adam. It's a pleasure.
Third time lucky.
Hey! What prize do we win?
Not that we were unlucky before, but it's been great every time I've had you. And this time we're hoping today to speak a little bit more about a particular topic, why we push so hard in yoga, and if that's anything to do with the context, let's say the modern, we don't say the Western context, but maybe the modern capitalist context, or just the modern context outside India, or modernity in general, I suppose.
I think in general might be, the key to it in a way, because let's face it, a lot of these systems of postural practice, they originate in India, whether they've been adapted and commercialized more in this sort of intervening century or not. And there was quite a lot of pushing going on right at the beginning. If you think about Krishnamacharya and his interest in promoting yoga with demonstrations, it's a very famous story of BKS Iyengar, ripping his hamstrings, doing Hanumanasana, which he wasn't really fit for. In fact, he complained he couldn't do it, and so Krishnamacharya cut his shorts so that he could.
Cut his shorts, yeah.
So there's definitely always been a pushing going on in the background when it comes to performance, I think. And it's the performance side of things that seems to be part of the problem.
Yeah. And before I go on, I wanted to just mention, before we get stuck into the conversation, Daniel's written an excellent book, Truth of Yoga. I think he's talked about it before. Please get it. It's really I'd say the only book that I think is accessible to the obvious non-academic scholar. The book that I always recommend for my the people that I do intensive with. And it's an easy read, and it gives you an overview, because I never understood, Daniel, where the Upanishads fit into the Vedas and where the Bhagavad fits in with Tantra, and how the whole thing fits together. So I think you made it really accessible, and I really thank you for that. Again, I wanted to say that.
Thank you, Adam.
Appreciate it further, and I forget at the end. But I think along those lines, if I could segue into it, I think another point that I made when we were discussing this podcast was kind of the general confusion about asana, and I feel that's one area that we get stuck in, that we don't really know quite what we're doing it for. And I think that the confusion, you mentioned in your book there's a tantric school, and that's one definite kind of line in the sand through the tradition of yoga. And there's also a classical school, and that's Patanjali, perhaps the Bhagavad Gita, many of the Upanishads, perhaps. You'll say it better than I, but nevertheless, my feeling, and let me just say this, and you can jump on this, but that there's a confusion because we're doing all these asanas. And yet, the main source text is Patanjali's Yoga Sutras, Sthiram Sukham Asanam. Yoga is a steady, comfortable position, basically for stilling the mind. And yet we're doing all these asanas. So there's kind of a discrepancy. We kind of get a bit confused as to what our aim is, to be clear on the aim. And approaching a practice without a completely clear aim, I kind of feel is part of the problem. Yeah.
That's a very good point, yeah. Objectives have a lot to do with many things. And, obviously in the modern era, the main objective is related in some way to health and well-being for most people, whether it's physical health or mental health. It's less likely to be, more aligned with the original aim of escaping from a cycle of births, although some people may be pushing it all the way. And I think that, immediately tells us something about what's going on with the body. It's an embodied approach to practice, and it's about, doing things with the body. And that was not, the modality to the otherworldly aim and the objective of early yoga, because the word asana just had nothing to do with the shapes that we associate it with until 1,000 years ago. It comes from a verbal root in Sanskrit, as, which means to sit, and an asana is a thing you sit on. You sit on your asana, and it's either a seat or the posture in which you're sitting. And as you say, Patanjali says very little about it in the Yoga Sutra, other than that you should be steady and comfortable. But he also clarifies that the way that you get steady and comfortable is by relaxing effort and becoming absorbed in the infinite. And it's that connection really that is completely lost, I think, in a striving approach to modern stretching, let's say, because they've taken something from one context that was about how to sit comfortably for a long time in meditation and tried to turn it into guidance for performativity in shape making. And the two have really no connection with each other. And there's another stage that goes even beyond all of that. It's only about 1,000 years ago that there are any other shapes called asanas described in text. And there aren't very many of them at first. And it's really in the last few centuries that people have listed multiple postures and suggested that they might even be joined together in some ways. And it's really probably only in the last 100 years that we can definitely say for sure that that's been a primary means of teaching yoga, sequences of postures taught to groups of drop-in students. So there's a completely different, approach in terms of what you do and why you do it in that context to almost anything we find in any of the sources that people want to turn to explain it. So actually, we're left with a gap. And what fills in the gap is usually a load of baggage in our own minds or preconceived assumptions that may or may not have anything to do with yoga.
Yeah, you said it better than me. That's basically what I was touching upon, is that you've definitely got this kind of one idea. Yoga is a steady position, sit still and steady the mind. And then we're doing this essentially embodied practice. And there's a discrepancy between, we're trying to translate one thing to the other. We can't find a clear translation of the one to the other because, the other, which is moving around with loads of asanas, seems slightly redundant if you're just trying to sit and still the mind. And then we end up pushing ourselves because we kind of almost don't know what else to do. There's a wish to strive, but we have no clear guidance about how to strive. I think that's definitely part of it, I think. Yeah. And my feeling, I'm not sure how you would agree with this, is that the idea that we should allay yoga slightly more to the tantric context, where at least we can say there's something about the spine, and there's something about a kind of creating an inner tensegrity or pressure, some kind of context of stimulating the spine. And I think that may be a way to inform the asana stretches, so we're not just simply stretching, because otherwise we're just going to allay our own cultural context of stretching on the asana, and then over top of that, maybe put a little bit of Patanjali as a little veneer.
Well, I guess then we'll still have to add the same caveat, because the original tantric context for all of this was still seated practice, and the influence of that philosophy from the tantric worldview on some of the more wild and out there yogis is what gives us physical yoga practices in the last 1,000 years, and they slowly develop. But asana was always presented as basically a cleansing preliminary. It's more like a kriya. It's something you do to make yourself capable of doing the real deal, which is what you were just describing, related to manipulation of energy up the spine's central channel. And you don't have to make shapes to do that. You've just got to have the ability, it says at the end of the first chapter of the Adda Pradipika, to maintain, a firm and steady posture and also hold bandhas, because you've got to create this pressure inside the sort of the torso. And that's what heats things up, and you blow your mind with your own energy, basically, rather than just sitting still. But that's still, again, very different to what's going on in the modern world. This was the original point of Mark Singleton's yoga body, which got a bad rap in yoga practitioner circles. But the point it was trying to make, that wasn't always very clearly understood, was that the context in which physical practice was presented in the last 100 years was very different to that we just described. The medieval emphasis on manipulation of energy through subtle channels for the cultivation of something that may or may not be related to Kundalini, depending on which text you're looking at. You just don't find that being the means of instruction in the modern world. You might get some references to it when people want to flesh things out, but for the most part, people are trying to feel more comfortably embodied. And that is probably the honest truth that a lot of us shy away from admitting, because we want to sound more spiritual and we want to sound more traditional. However, there are no traditional texts that talk about asana practice in the way that the modern world presents it. Really, Krishnamacharya's attempt to sort of in a way, invent his own tradition around the asana practice he was teaching is really all we've got.
Oh, you're going to upset people with that one.
Well, I mean, this doesn't mean it's bad. I want to really emphasize this, Adam, because I think this is a thing that I think people often get the idea that it has to be old to be authentic, and also that to suggest that things aren't quite as we've been told is somehow to diss them, or to suggest they should all be thrown out the window, or there's something wrong with them. I'm a big fan of modern yoga. I've been a modern yoga practitioner for more than 2 decades. It's done me a lot of good in my life. I'm just trying to emphasize that modern yoga is not the same thing as yoga from 2000 years ago, and there is absolutely no evidence to support the idea that it is. And that doesn't really matter. What matters is trying to think about why we're doing what we're doing now and how to still build a connection to the past, which we can. And obviously it's not redundant to speak about old texts in the modern context. It's just that they're not describing what we do.
Yeah, I might argue a little bit with that, right? I mean, my idea, and it is a creative jump, as it were, anyway, a slight reappraisal of the tantric idea that you have a spinal stimulator. When you're moving the spine, regardless of whether you're going to raise Kundalini and you say blow your mind, which I totally agree with was the original idea. Say you're moving the spine in a slightly lighter, slightly less violent way, right? And you're moving the spine, right? People get emotional in class of yoga, particularly emotional, where they don't get emotional necessarily running or in a class of rock climbing or something, because of all these exercises that are particularly spinally motivated or spinally oriented, right? So you're doing a lot of spinal manipulation. The nerves of the spine, obviously incredibly important for the brain, stimulates the brain. And essentially, I mean, some texts, I think I was reading something recently saying it actually disrupts the pathways of the nerve pathways through the body to the brain again. So the idea that I have, and again, a little bit of creative leeway, is that maybe you are doing something kind of tantric light here in terms of changing the mental pathways in the brain, perhaps not completely blowing that conditioning, which is, I think, the original idea, overhaul the nervous system altogether, perhaps not overhaul it, but reappropriate it slightly by giving yourself this space and time through these vigorous spinal exercises that are tapas, that are heating, that are, pressurizing the spine still. And that might be a way forward to reappraising or reframing the context of yoga outside stretching, because then you're having to push together. You're having to use an isometric stretch, which is a stretch of balancing forces back into the body, rather than what I find is endemically injurious to people, looking at the hatha yoga as just simply stretching into a passive kind of, external stretch as far as possible.
Well, I think that's a very good example of what I was sort of hinting at, Adam. It's a creative, but at the same time, well articulated and quite well grounded attempts to build a bridge between then and now.
I think you have to somewhat.
Yeah, well, you do. I'm not trying to say that we exist in a vacuum and that there's no way that these, paradigms can be sort of repackaged to fit what we're doing. It's just that we won't find that articulation in an old text. We'll have to invent it for ourselves. And there won't be, therefore, a right way of doing it necessarily. There might be some clearly identifiable wrong ways, but there might be lots of valid ways that you can make these connections. And that might be one way of articulating it. And in the end, I think you're right that the nervous system is clearly what's being worked on, whether or not that's what the ancient yoga texts were trying to talk about. And there's been an attempt since the mid-19th century to say everything about the subtle yogic body is actually mapped to the various plexuses of the nervous system, and all sorts of other ways of talking about the endocrine glands and goodness knows what. And it may well sort of correlate, but that doesn't mean that that's what these guys were necessarily doing. I think it's more helpful, again, to see that there's a subtle yogic body that texts talk about actually in conflicting ways. So, Krishnamacharya was schooled in the worldview that Kundalini was a blockage that had to be burned out of the way so that prana could flow in the central channel, not that Kundalini was the thing to awaken. So, already there, how do you make those two opposites fit together in a model of the yogic body? There are many yogic bodies, and I don't think they all, in fact, or necessarily any of them map to what we can observe with modern scientific equipment. In fact, you can definitely not find any chakras and whatnot with any kind of scans or dissections of corpses. That doesn't mean that they're sort of, completely meaningless. It's just that they are their own realm, and they're part of a connection between the mind and the body in a way that we approach embodiment. But it's all within a structure of trying to do a quite specific thing, and taking the language of those tools out of that context, for example, into the modern world and saying, put these crystals on various body parts and that will cleanse your chakras, just hasn't got anything to do with that original framework, and is probably therefore somewhat meaningless. But I say only somewhat, because if you invest it with meaning, it may well manifest all the things that you expect it to bring, because that's how the mind works. So it's complicated, really.
It is, but I kind of feel if we were more schooled in the idea, or at least more aware in the idea that we were doing something that maybe at the end of the day, we're not denying here, I think either of us, that in the end of the day, yoga has that facility to at least calm the fluctuations of the mind, if not stop. I mean, I'm not agreeing stopping, but certainly concentrate one, and the mindset, kind of allow a greater equilibrium at very least. But nevertheless, that happens through going through a process. I mean, I don't know whether that happened to you, but certainly with me, I kind of feel that there's a lot of thrashing out somewhat in going through it, quite an emotional process. I mean, perhaps you felt the same, but many do, I know, an emotional process on the mat, yeah, whereby emotions were coming up, and perhaps they were, perhaps I'm a little bit romantic about it, but I feel that it was a slight cleansing out, and that we should be well aware that the process of doing this is somewhat emotional, perhaps. And I think because perhaps we're not often informed of that in the class setting, that we're all meant to be good yoga students, equanimous and stilling the mind and shanti, and that it is a kind of a somewhat violent process of tackling yourself. And it may be, I shouldn't be violent in the class, of course, especially not to other students, but nevertheless, there is a sense of emotions coming up, and that often translates to wanting to escape them. And what's the first thing you do when you want to escape an emotion? You push out of your body to try and get out of that emotion, I think, so, or you feel frustrated with yourself, so you push yourself more because of all this stuff that comes up with your own body when you're moving it, and this isn't given enough space. And I think that's one reason why people over push themselves. I mean, we're going to probably do it anyway because it's emotional, but at least if I had this context a little bit more drawn out to me, that this is the space that you're entering into, it might have been helpful.
Well, yes, and I think now we're into the realm where classical yoga philosophy still makes, almost 100% sense, because people are still people and minds work in quite predictable ways. We've got much more sophisticated in how we can observe what they do, and there's all sorts of theories about why they do that. But the bottom line is, we make ourselves miserable in quite predictable ways. And a lot of that's to do with, the conditioning that the mind, picks up, and the patterns it gets stuck in, and the tendencies that express themselves as a result of that. And, really what yoga is about is trying to unwind the deleterious effects of that conditioning in the hope that more clarity and all sorts of other things that might come from that clarity will be revealed. And through that, perhaps even to see, a completely different way of perceiving and even of being. And so that's, still entirely relevant. I guess I was just trying to emphasize that there's no guarantee that making shapes has got anything to do with those objectives unless we're really understanding what those objectives are. And I think, again, you've articulated quite clearly there a way in which this is going to happen whether we want it to or not, because paying attention to what's happening in our mind-body system will reveal some of that painful conditioning to us. And we've got a choice of feeling into that and letting it reveal itself and trying to process it. And we've also got the other option, which is to try and make it go away because it's not comfortable. And I think we're then in the realm of addiction, really, whether it's full-blown addiction acting out in other ways beyond what happens often in a yoga context, which is basically a sort of yoga addiction. And what seems to be the characteristic of that is often telling ourselves that we're doing something while actually doing something else. And so there's a lot of people I've come across over the last couple of decades who say to me things about what they are doing through their bodies and how they're getting more embodied and getting more in touch with who they are, while they actually seem to be dissociating and reminding me very much of what I used to do by chain smoking cannabis.
Yeah. You document that well. I often hear you talk about your dope smoking. I think that's it. I mean, I think that, and especially with the rigorous practice, it seems like we're trying to go into the body by these asanas becoming more advanced and more dynamic. But actually, in my own experience, having done all these quite advanced asanas because I had the body for it, is that you numb yourself, and it is addictive, as you say. And it's almost like the more you push, the more you become desensitized. That's the paradox of it,
Yes.
You think you're going into the body and embodying these things more, but actually, it actually puts a lid on things rather well. So you can go on for years saying you're doing this kind of practice of kind of, Patabi Joyce, you say purification. And I'm with that, because I do think there's an emotional aspect, and I do think it did help me in that capacity a great deal. But I think there was many years as well of trying to numb myself over to not feel, through doing dynamic practice as well.
I think that's exactly what I was hinting at, Adam, and you say it very clearly. Yeah, and if only there was more honesty about that in the Ashtanga world, I think it would. There is sometimes there are some very good teachers I know who really draw attention to that and try and encourage backing off and feeling into and letting go of, rather than striving for more. But there is in the Ashtanga method, obviously, this other aspect, which is the fixed sequence and the fact that you're not supposed to go beyond a certain point until your teacher says so. So that built into it, there is the striving tendency, and the way in which teachers often dangle that possibility or withhold it is actually feeding the addictive brain, grasping for more and feeling denied, and somehow there's an identity built around achievement. Even the way teachers talk about advanced students because they're capable of busting out weird moves rather than because they're particularly equanimous or nice to be around. And there's not necessarily a connection between the two things. In fact, as you were just sort of pointing to, if you're getting more desensitized, if you're getting more sort of discombobulated in a way, but in a sort of feel-good bubble, you might be more likely to actually be acting out unconsciously in really unskillful ways and not able to see it. So actually, you might be less capable than this very stiff person who knows very well their limitations and is trying to offset them and really confronting them day in, day out. So it's a paradox sometimes.
Sounds like you've been to Mysore. Yeah, I don't think you have.
Well,
no, it's true. I mean, there can certainly be an inverse correlation there with the advancement of asana and the general relative pragmatic sense of self in the everyday world as trying to be a relatively informed and decent person. Unfortunately, because it does some weird stuff to your brain. I mean, honestly, putting your leg behind it, particularly the leg behind the head, and the advanced back bends, kapotasana and such, stimulates the spine to such a degree that it does make you feel pretty weird at times, to be honest with you. And I think I think I come back to again is not drawing the context of this more. Let's try and flesh this out more, and that's why we're doing this today. And generally as teachers, to say that there is this, it's not all shanty, and you should be well aware that these things happen, and that there is also this process of which is very much feeds into the conditioning of a let's say say Western, but a modern pursuit of linear progress. Whereas even 100 years ago, even when you're in UK, I'm English, even in Britain, I'm thinking of the cycles of the seasons, the harvests, all this stuff that shows that there's this wheel of progress that is going in concentric spirals, inwards, right? But now we've got is linear progress, there's no sense of vertical progress, that the future is better. And people say to me all the time, well, I feel I'm making progress. I mean, it leads literally just forward, and I think it's hard to get out of that because it's so inbuilt I think it's the economic paradigm really that, you will go on the treadmill, you will get your qualifications, you will get your work, and you will advance in your life in this manner, literally and chronologically.
Let's borrow the sort of economic phrasing, return on investment, basically. I put X in, I expect Y out. Otherwise, I haven't got value for money. And most people won't describe their investment in yoga in those terms, but on some level, there is some expectation that it's leading somewhere. And again, I think if we were to come back, as we did at the very beginning of this chat, to objectives and to really think, well, where am I trying to go with all of this? Because actually there isn't anywhere to go except here in the end anyway. And, perhaps just to be more fully here is a perfectly legitimate objective. But I think instead what tends to happen is this, I think, unspoken faith that getting better at bending and stretching the body is somehow going to unlock some new capabilities as a human. And I have a classic example of this I saw this week. A very accomplished Ashtanga Asana practitioner who was posting about some injury setbacks and talking about how everything doesn't move in a linear way. There are ups and downs, but it was all couched in this kind of expectation that there would be more ups. And I think
it's still going in the right direction, literally physically forward.
the most helpful thing that can happen to most people is, encountering, as happened to the Buddha, which set him on the path to the enlightenment that he eventually enjoyed, was sickness, old age, and death. And so once you get to the point that it's never going to go further up the chain, and instead it's just making peace with the decay of everything, then the real practice starts, I think. That's something I've seen him.
Yeah, you maybe experienced it.
Yeah.
You talk about your difficulties with your own hips. I've also got a hip issue, which definitely doesn't allow any literal forward progress to happen anymore. And actually, I don't want to paint a gloss on it, but it's a great place to be. It's actually a very, very enjoyable place to be, rather than chasing that kind of proverbial carrot forever to some unknown place where the opening of the body will somehow relate to the opening of the ego, which is the unspoken, I'm going to let go of my ego the more I force my body, because it's all about surrender. It's an insidious narrative, and especially when it's couched in the teacher as well, saying, surrender to my adjustment.
Yeah.
That's increasing, that's even more problematic, perhaps. Oh, it's just ego, you're holding, Yeah.
Well, it is complicated, and I think the thought that comes up for me, going back to some of the themes we've touched on, is that first of all, perhaps my most powerful experience of bursting through layers and being overwhelmed with emotions and confronted with all of my conditioning and patterns, happened the first time I sat a silent meditation retreat and spent a lot of time not moving, not really doing anything energetic to my body, and my body produced all of these energetic experiences, including feeling like I was rushing on pills, all sorts of weird stuff going on, just because it's fields of consciousness and energetic experience of being alive, and the mind and the body can create all sorts of things. And many of my most unhelpful tendencies were revealed to me in those 10 days that I spent on that first retreat, that I'm still working on 20 years later. And I think there's a lot to be said for the fact that there are whole approaches to similar objectives to that pursued by yoga practitioners that don't require you to do any of these asanas, and that therefore the asanas are not the magic ingredient that necessarily take you there. That's really all I wanted to get towards saying, and that actually it can be quite liberating to let go of that idea, because that's never been part of the yoga tradition, and we're sort of, I think, hoping that they will somehow give us some other thing than the ability to put our body into funny positions and the softening of the mind that's required to actually embrace some of the discomfort that you meet along the way to doing that. But that in itself isn't necessarily the best we can hope for from yoga practice. That's just side effects of striving.
Yeah, or almost, the realization, albeit a modern kind of a take on asana, of the Sisyphean challenge in the first place, that you recognize that in the end, through doing something hard, that there simply is that realization that you're always just pushing the boulder up the hill, and that's all right in the end. You come to that place in the end through that striving, through that ambition. Because I think for many people, just sitting on the mat doesn't challenge them enough that one gets to that stage. If you've got ambition and competition and all that stuff in you, then, in some respects, that's why I see that the Mysore paradigm, I'm talking about my experience with Patabi Joyce and Shirat Joyce here, as fairly useful if you look at it carefully. And you're in this room with all this bunch of people, all fairly advanced or, a level, and there's all this competition, ego going on. And if you can see it well enough, bloody useful, actually. You can see your part in it, and how you're doing it to yourself, and potentially in a kind of rather kind of psychotherapeutic manner, there is a possibility of some kind of release of that can go on. I think. That was my experience anyway. I don't know.
I think you're right, and I think obviously there's a reason that a lot of people practice asana and not so many sit on a meditation cushion, because it does do something to us. I'm not suggesting it's got no benefits. It was what got me involved in this worldview in a practical way in the first place. Was that I had a way in. It was something I could do. I could follow some basic instructions, and they had an effect on me, and that changed the way I saw things, and that was very empowering. And so, obviously asana has its place, and for some people it's the best way to do things because they just don't have the temperament to be able to sit still with themselves. But that does reveal something, the fact that we're unwilling to be with ourselves and that we need strong stimulation as the medicine. And that, in fact, as you go over time, again, you have to keep upping the dose of stimulation to get, the same medicinal effect. Again, we're back to addiction. And there are lots of people with various forms of addiction I've encountered in the yoga asana world, particularly in the Ashtanga world. And I'm not saying, it's better to have an asana addiction than a heroin addiction, perhaps, but it's still an addiction, and the mind is still doing that thing. And I think, as a culture, we are addicted. The whole mechanism driving consumer capitalism is getting people to chase unnecessary manufactured wants because they're made to feel lacking and to never therefore be capable of satisfying themselves. In fact, the whole of yoga philosophy is built on the idea that that's the nature of suffering, to be striving for some lasting satisfaction that can never be attained. And so the clearer we can be about the fact that what we're doing in practice terms might not actually be helping, the better skilled we can become at trying to make sure we don't replicate that tendency in our practice.
Yeah. And the clue is that you're trying to be with yourself, and then one's looking to deepen a posture in every posture that's going in the kind of categorically the opposite direction, really, of restlessly seeking more, when the whole idea is, to try and be there as you are.
Yes, exactly.
But I think it's in the matrix. I mean, the setup itself is really problematic. I mean, as I said, I think some of the possibility that I hope for in an optimistic manner is that there could be some reframing of the ideas around the class, whereby there is some process of going on, like you might not get just through sitting on the couch, that you can see these tendencies, you can see that there's something that wants to get out, because I think as Leslie Kaminoff said to me, you can injure yourself with a baked bee can if you want, if there's a will, there's a way. I can say to people, don't hurt yourself in asana, take it easy, but if there's emotion inside, it happens. And so, in one sense, I say, well, don't feel bad about hurting yourself because you pushed too far, because there's emotion in it. But in another sense, I also say there's ways and means where we might be more informed about this, setting up a class situation, or talking online about the subject most generally, in as much as phrasing that this, to be aware of this tendency, and also the logistics of how it's set up. There is this linear series which suggests a betterment, in an ambiguous manner, that, better asanas will involve generally happier sense of self. How that's going to take place, we don't know, but we assume that it will. And people encourage us, teachers, etc., can't encourage us that it will. Yeah. And then they say, you can't do the next posture until you've completed this one. And that obstacle also redefines the fact that there's something behind the door, because now the door is closed. So it must be something better behind that door, and there's all these ways, unfortunately, that Ashtanga can lead to this pushing and pushing to try and achieve something ambiguously better on the other side. So it's a logistics part. I mean, sorry, Daniel, I'll let you speak in a second, but I kind of feel like there's some maybe reframing of some of it where we might be able to, I'm not going to throw the baby out of the bathwater. I'm an Ashtanga teacher, and I think it's a good system, and I think it has its great benefits and has benefited me. But I often feel that there's some context is everything. Is plumbing a deeper context and understanding that there is these things that want to come up and need to be addressed. And it's there you go.
Well, I think you're right, and I think on levels that we've touched on already, I wholeheartedly agree in that asana is beneficial. I have been inspired by Ashtanga methodology for more than 10 years in what I do in my practice, even though I'm now incapable of doing even most of the primary series properly. But I enjoy the basic modality that was stitched together through this system of moving the body carefully, and yet at the same time in coordination with breathing and concentration of where you're gazing. And I think combining that with some engagement with there being a subtle level to embodiment is it's a great thing, and I don't want to suggest that in any way that should stop. But I think the problem is that people call that yoga. And that's not, again, if we're going to look back to the older texts, what yoga was. And it's not to suggest that we should all do 2,000-year-old practices. It's just to point to the fact that originally yoga was the state of being attained through practices. The practice was not called yoga. It's called meditation or pranayama, or the Bhagavad Gita's got a whole laundry list of various options of bhakti and karma and jnana and dhyana and various other things. And then there's hatha yoga. So, what we're doing is a subset of hatha yoga, which is yoga basically attained through forceful means. And that's actually what's happening. We're forcing our bodies to try and get into a state. And it's helpful, I think, to see that the state is the thing that's yoga, and that would require us to start thinking about, well, what is it that we're actually trying to aim for? And to be clear about what's stopping us from getting there, and to think about everything in terms of that. And then, calling what we do as a practice asana and not calling it yoga. and then it's immediately taken down a few rungs in its sort of prioritization. It's a thing you can do. It's asana in combination with bandha and with some sort of, I guess, simplified pranayama in there as well. And, there's also place given the chanting at the beginning and the end for thinking about sound. But it's still, it's methodologies towards an objective. And the yoga is only going to bubble up out of it all if it's anchored in a broader context. And some will say, yes, well, that's all there. You read the Bhagavad Gita and you practice your asana in a certain way, and it's all taken care of. And I think that's often the way that there's a bit of a bypass going on, not looking at this difficulty that we're facing. And that's where I would bring in another word, I think. Even rather than calling it asana practice, I would rather we all just called it tapas. So what we do with the body is this, it's not austerity is sometimes, the way of translating tapas, in the sense of, it should cause pain, like holding your arm above your head for so many years that it withers and you couldn't bring it down if you wanted to. But instead that we think of it as, the conscious generation of some friction, going against the grain, trying to work against our unhelpful tendencies. The Yoga Sutra is really clear and says, basically do that or you won't get anywhere in your yoga practice. It's one of the ingredients offered for the people at the start of the second chapter who are incapable of focusing their minds. A bit of tapas, svadhyaya, Euphoria pranidhana is kriya yoga. That will get you started. It will deal with your kleshas. And that's what we've all got, kleshas, these afflicted states of mind. So those are the three things we need to deal with. I like to think of tapas as something you do with your body. Svadhyaya is something you're doing with your mind. And Euphoria pranidhana is something you're doing with, whatever is beyond the mind and the body. And so we need to be doing some of that. And asana takes very good care of the tapas part of it. But what about the other two parts? And an attempt to pretend that asana covers all of that, I think, is misleading. It's much more helpful to then think, well, I need to study. I need to ask honest questions about what's going wrong with my practice, as well as telling myself all sorts of comforting stories about where it might be leading. And then also the number one thing, the problem is us and our self-centered worldview and our accumulative tendencies and this colonizing desire to somehow get hold of something and make it our own. And if we could see that actually the way forward is to let go of all of that, and always has been, and that's why original yogis were renouncers, the easier it will be to start to see when we're doing that and to just soften a little bit around it. And the easiest way to do that obviously is to put something else at the center of the universe instead of yourself, hence religious devotion. But that doesn't speak to you. There's still a way of loosening the bonds of ego addiction as well. So that's my sense of how we could reframe it. Turn it all into kriya yoga. Asana is the tapas. Where are the other things?
I think there is a precedent for that. I think the Hatha Yogi was called a Tapasyan, almost interchangeable in I think at points in terms of the nomenclature around
yes
that.
Yes and no. I mean, that was the 19th century misunderstanding of colonial scholars, was that Hatha Yoga was just people basically destroying their bodies. You look up Hatha Yoga in the Sanskrit English dictionary and it says that basically it's the things people do, torturing themselves needlessly, as described in the Hatha Yoga Pradipika. And that's not what it says in the Hatha Pradipika. I think it's the 61st verse of the first chapter, at least in the old version of it. Scholars are coming up with a new critical edition that will scramble everybody's numbering. But that says that the things you should avoid that will be injurious to yoga practice, one of those is kaya klesha, injuring the body. You've got klesha again, but it's there's these detrimental actions to the kaya, the body, and that's not Hatha Yoga. Hatha Yoga is about skillful use of embodiment to go beyond the body. So it's cultivating force inside the body. It's not being forceful with the body. And that's the key distinction.
I like your idea of cultivating friction. That's a good idea. I think there is a sense of going against the grain. Yeah, that's a good way to look at it. Something where you find your tendencies when you, like I said, the more than just sitting on the mat, you're doing something where you challenge yourself, and there's a sense of awareness, a sense of coming through something pragmatically more. I'm circling back to that idea that the aims in the first place need to be clarified, and just kind of like pragmatizing those rather than having this idealistic idea. Because if you look at those aims, as you said, it's like, well, hands up, as you often say, I love that one, hands up who wants not to be reborn again. Because that is the original. I mean, it's a great, funny little quote from Daniel, but that's that's obviously the original aim. Even in tantric yoga, unfortunately for me, I have to admit that the aim is basically to circumvent, whilst having a little bit of pleasure. You're allowed in hatha and tantric hatha yoga as well. You're allowed to seek a bit of pleasure along the way, but ultimately, the aim is to transcend the world. And and are we doing that? I often ask, the main kind of modern reappraisal of yoga from Krishnamacharya onwards comes to practical use of yoga for practical lives that aren't necessarily wishing to do that, and then the aims need to be rephrased or reconsidered.
Yeah, and Krishnamacharya did. I think Krishnamacharya gave us an interesting precedent, because he said, basically it's okay to practice the health and well-being, and he aligns, in his later life, a lot of what he presented with Ayurvedic principles, to think of it, in terms of therapy in that sense. But he also, encouraged religious devotion, and at the same time promoted the idea that you can do everything that traditional yoga said you could attain. And so there's a sort of ladder of possibilities, but at the same time I think it's helpful to not suggest that top of the tree is the ultimate goal. Otherwise everybody likes to pretend they're going to the ultimate goal. We all like to cosplay, we could say, in the modern era, that we're anything, whatever we can imagine that's sort of desirable, we want it and we want to be it. And it's much more, I think, helpful to just say there's a spectrum of possibilities, and there's no sort of benefit to being at either extreme, really. There's just this spectrum. We're all somewhere on this spectrum, and we may move day by day to different parts of it. But if we can actually just think, what is it I'm trying to do now through my yoga practice, and be honest with our response, it will change. When I started, it was very clear, and it had nothing to do with any of these philosophical objectives. I just wanted to, honestly, the simple answer was I wanted to stop myself really hating myself, and a bit of space from that process that I was going through quite intensely at that time in my life was very revelatory. It made me actually have to acknowledge I don't feel that way all the time. And so that for me was what got me to go back to yoga class. And I like this feeling of, I don't hate myself anymore. And I might have to let up on punishing myself, although obviously I then turned my asana practice to a certain extent into another way to punish myself. So by pushing beyond my body's natural limits. But no, I think, there's always a change, but, it's helpful to see that there's not necessarily a hierarchy involved. What matters is the hierarchy is of honesty, to be honest. I've got a lot of time for somebody who says, I do yoga because I want to look good naked. That's great. You've been honest. I respect that. Because I think, clarity of,
there's never just one thing going on anyway.
No,
right?
of course.
Because obviously you want to look good naked, because there's a sense of, sense of lack in oneself. So you want to kind of like that external verification.
Well, not necessarily. I think it's just more, it's an attempt to somehow just be honest, not just with ourselves, but in relation to all these big ideas, and to not pretend that we're borrowing the big ideas when we actually aren't. That's all I was really getting at. A slightly facetious, exaggerated example.
No, it was a good. I liked it, and also the fact that maybe you asked the question, and the question just almost in a Socratic sense pertains to the I don't know. I practice because I don't know. I don't know why I'm practicing, but I feel like something's not right, and I'm doing it because I'm waiting in that space for something to come into that space, because, I really don't know what I'm aiming for here, right? Because we don't know why we're here. We don't know who we are. That's the whole problem. So we practice for that question, to keep that question in mind, perhaps. I wanted to ask, I thought you said it beautifully, actually. I wish I'd said that myself again. That, just a space to stop hating oneself. And I think that rings true with many people. I applaud you for your honesty there, because it certainly was the case of why I started practicing as well. But do you think that's more? And the last question is: do you think that's particular? I mean, I'd say it's a Western malaise again, but a modern malaise, really. That when we see it in 1800s, there wasn't this sense of shame and guilt so much. At least when we look at Indian texts, perhaps when we look at Western texts, and now I can maybe say East and West a little bit more, we don't find, oh, you're wrong, you're sinning, you're guilty in the Eastern text. It's simply you're not seeing clearly. That's the problem. You're not bad. You're just not seeing life as it is. In the West, you're inherently sinful. You're born into sin. You should be ashamed. If you just devote yourself enough, you can be cleansed of your wrongness, your badness, right? And I think that it taps into modern capitalism as well. And I think that unfortunate kind of foundation leads us to a lot of this kind of pushing out of shame and guilt in practice, or at least that was my experience, where perhaps if we'd seen 1800s Eastern country climates, India, etc., practicing, there wouldn't have been this underlying malaise so much that you're wrong, you're sinful, you should be, practicing to kind of punish yourself. Well, we have a bit of punishing though, don't we, in the Eastern, in India as well. So perhaps I'll renege on that a little bit. What do you think?
It's a good question, Adam. I think, there is. I mean, just look at any of the texts on Dharma, which have got a slightly caste-based fixation on purity, but they're often talking about what you need to do to maintain purity. So Dharma, in that sense, really meaning the rules, the laws that you're supposed to follow, and the various things you do for, basically atoning for breaking the rules. And yoga creeps in those contexts. Pranayama is prescribed. A certain number of rounds of pranayama and mantra recitations will even, make good on having slept with your teacher's wife, or murder a Brahmin. You can even get rid of that with pranayama. And this is all grouped under the heading of prayashchitta, which is basically penance. And so there is something a little bit like, a weird kind of Christian self-loathing, self-flagellating tendency built into those texts on that level. But that's all to do with caste. When it comes to actually what's liberating from a yoga perspective, I think you're right. It is about just misperception. And, in the Western world, I think we have compounded all of this, as you were saying, through, consumer capitalism and the, mass marketing of lack. And this, constant obsession with, we need something outside of ourselves to feel whole within ourselves. I don't think that can possibly have been so widespread before the mass media promotion of it, because it had to be generated and industry had to be developed to come up with the idea. Otherwise, people would just, I don't need any of that, and walk away. So I think there's that playing in there. But I don't know. At the same time, I also think there is something timeless about people, and that's where the description of the kleshas in terms of craving and aversion. We have this desire to get more of what feels good and to avoid what feels bad. And usually, what this is all revolving around is the identity of being a person, and our identity is very much constructed of things we like and things we don't like. You look at a dating website and it's people that's listing all these lists, a bit like a teenager. I like these bands, therefore I'm a person that you might want to be together with for the rest of your life. And I sometimes think that, that's part of the problem. It's sort of feeding this attempt to describe ourselves into being and always fearing that it's not good enough. Eric Fromm in The Art of Loving talks about it as the marketing mentality, and that's what you see on these dating apps. But it's very much a disease of capitalism, but it's tying into something deep-seated in people, I think, of what's the face I'm showing to the world. And what yoga was supposed to be, I guess, pointing towards was the fact that that's the problem. This question about what's the face, being a person is the problem. The solution is to transcend the need to project an image outwards. And so in that sense, I do think it is quite a timeless thing, but we've totally turbocharged it and combined it with this, obsession with the self and self gratification and everything else that is particularly Western in its flavor that's now colonized the world thanks to global capitalism and all these adjuncts.
What a mess. I mean, it's a very deep point I think you're pointing at, but the sense that there's a persona, there's a mask, and then one feels guilty about projecting that mask because, of course, one isn't essentially that. really,
Yes, one
without,
knows deep down
over and above
that it's
everything, there's
all
a sense of
it's all
identity,
the
which
story.
one feels that, we all have identities and you're hiding behind it.
Yeah, and we fear at our deepest level that we're going to be unmasked and
Discovered.
exposed,
Exactly. Yeah.
found out.
Yeah.
Imposter syndrome.
We can talk on all different tangents from here, actually. But I think, you point out many good points about this, but also I think that there is something to do with, particularly Westerns, to do with guilt and shame around the body. When you see Westerners going to colonialize, even India, right? They didn't have that sense of, covering up, etc., etc. I believe, if I'm corrected, before the Victorian, and pre-Victorian values were put upon them, right? This kind of shame and guilt about the body that I think comes from Europe, actually, which we don't see in other continents.
Well, I don't know. I think it also comes
Yeah.
from other Abrahamic religious contexts as well. I mean, the Islam that sort of percolated into India was fairly out there. There's much more Sufi tendency in it than sort of Wahhabis from Saudi Arabia. But still, there's I think as much as there is in Victorian Christianity, something lurking in the Islamic worldview that suggests women should cover themselves so as not to tempt men. That leads towards that kind of outcome as well. And so it's invasion of India from lots of different dimensions that probably contributed to that. And the contrast between what one can easily see in terms of a certain degree of repression sexually in modern India, and its deleterious consequences creeping out in all sorts of ways. Compare that to the Kama Sutra, and it's sort of place in a whole genre of text celebrating bodily pleasure, and the sculptures you can go and see that sort of epitomize that worldview in temples, no less, of people fornicating en masse. There was a celebration of that. It's part of life. It's one of the Purusharthas, along with Dharma, Artha, and Moksha.
Yeah. I don't think it's never as simple. Obviously, please excuse us, audience, for making these things somewhat simplified for the sake of this podcast. It's never as simple as just that. And you point out some good ideas. I do feel that there's this particularly kind of unfortunate European idea about the body-mind dualism and this separation of the body as somewhat lesser, at least lesser, and finally shameful, as the mind is pure, and ideal. And that's been there for a long time, hasn't it? A long time. Where to go from here? I mean, I think one thing is that the problem now is that when we talk about linear progress, and obviously originally when I was thinking to myself, well, those early teachers that talked to me, they didn't really have an idea they could make a career out of it. And that's one unfortunate thing with the pushing now, is that the modern yoga teacher generally feels they have to be the best in the room. So teachers, and students pushing themselves to have a career or be a popular yoga teacher because, well, yes, it actually does work. I mean, to some degree, right? Like, you do get what you want if you achieve those asanas. Again, to some degree, whether you end up wanting it at the expense of your own body is a whole other question. But unfortunately, the modern tendency is very different to those hippies in the 60s, 70s going over and saying, well, we just dropouts. That's what they, say about my teacher, Mark Darby, said to me, we're just dropping out. We won't actually make a career out of it. It was quite the opposite, almost disappointed when they did, And now, there were people going to Mysore, and in this sense that, if you push yourself through the series, then you'll get to be that teacher. And those teachers are all traveling, all glamorous, traveling the world like me. And, we're all so happy, not to say I've got a bad rap of it, but I think it does. Again, it can easily feed into a completely kind of the economic consumer capitalist perspective now, unfortunately.
Yeah, there is this in many ways acquisitive tendency, I think, that's crept into yoga, which is the exact antithesis of yoga philosophy. Yoga is talking about the ability to make do with nothing. When we really attaining the highest levels of contentment, you don't need anything, it says in the commentary with that goes with the Yoga Sutra. But I think obviously we do live in modern reality where you need money to get by, and people who love yoga look for a way to get by through yoga. So it's an understandable tendency.
Absolutely.
And
absolutely,
it's something that we both talk about, the reality of being out there and to a certain extent trying to sell. I mean, I only got on Instagram once I had a book coming out and felt, I want people to buy my book. I want them to read my book. I think my book's worth reading. I don't want to just sell it for the sake of selling product. At the same time, that made me put my head above the parapet and really go for it and start trying to, talk in public about these ideas. And then getting into teaching online courses off the back of the book. And in fact, there is a course based on the book, expanding on the book, that I'll be running live in November, if anyone's curious, truthofyoga.com. So there I go with some marketing, so I'm in no position to start throwing stones. But at the same time, I do feel, there's a difference, in the same way as somebody once pointed out to me, between the sort of original function of advertising, of basically trying to say, I've got a shop over here and it sells stuff and you might want what's there, and then just leaving people to decide whether or not they wanted to come, and the more sort of sinister refinements of that, which modern digital media have perfected, getting inside your skull and making you feel like your life will be transformed if only you can have that thing. I've got no interest in trying to make any of those claims to anybody. Your life will not be transformed by taking my course, but it might make you think. And it might give you an opportunity to have this kind of conversation that Adam and I are having, together, to think these things through, in real time. And that's where change happens. And that might change your life. But the course itself is just an opportunity to think.
Yeah. I think to reappraise, essentially when we talk about happiness these days, we're talking basically about an excited state of a kind of euphoria, really. I think that's what modern happiness, goes to. But if you look back, to the 17th century roots of excitement, it's an unpleasant state. One wouldn't want to be excited. It was used in a pejorative term. So I mean, also, just to rephrase that, maybe to come to our conclusion here, and look, we're looking for meaning, really. We're looking for more than excitement, more than euphoria, and these kind of conversations with me, and what I do and what Daniel does. Just give meaning to your life, and maybe it's not a conclusive sense of now I found the life's meaning and like I'm enlightened, but just like with the richness of tapestry and context and nuanced perspective, that's just that's deeply enriching and nourishing to one's life, over and above any sense of enlightenment, whatever that means. I mean, I was certainly striving for that now, and now I'll take just the enjoyment of just connecting to people and debating these kind of questions, much more fulfilling than when I was just seeking chitta vritti and rodahar and chanting the Yoga Sutras every time before bed,
Well, that's I think a sign of progress, to be honest, to get with where we are rather than where we think we might somehow magically end up. And for me, the meaning is it's just constructed through relationship, and that's been very sobering and humbling for me to accept in the last decade or so, because before that I was definitely on the same path. I spent a lot of time hanging out in India as a yoga bum, basically not really socializing a lot of the time, thinking if I practiced 6+ hours a day in one form or another, that would somehow do something to me that was going to, I think, if I'm really honest, deep down, make me special. That was my secret desire. It's an ego project. I want to be better than whatever it was I thought I was before, or perhaps even everybody else. It's ugly, and I'm quite glad to have gone beyond that. Because it leaves a bad smell in the little man cave that I was locked up in. But at the same time, back in the real world, I'm constantly confronted by how unskillful I am. Talk to my girlfriend if you want to hear about that. There's all sorts of ways in which my tendencies reveal themselves again and again and again, and I keep learning the same lessons.
Sorry, guys, we had a few blips and a short cutouts of the conversation. Daniel and I are speaking. He's in somewhere in the UK, Wiltshire or somewhere like that, I believe you are. Is that right?
Gloucester. Yes.
Gloucestershire, right. And I'm in India, so we're bridging, again, another modern way of doing things. We're speaking from different continents, and there's been a few glitches, so apologies for that. But roughly speaking, I think you've heard most of the chat that Daniel and I have had. I mean it when I say Daniel's become a friend. But other than that, objectively speaking, I bloody like the book. I think it's really clear, and I'm fairly reasonably intelligent, but not that cut out for academia whatsoever. So he's made those concepts that are quite difficult, very, very easy for anyone to read that, in his Truth of Yoga book. So I'll just, definitely recommend it. And please please look at his course as well. I might even pop up there, Daniel, and give you a fright on the other end.
Amazing.
So thanks again for coming on. It's been a great chat. We'll put the show notes in the description and where you can find Daniel, and you know where to find me anyway. So I'm not shutting up yet. Anyway, if you like it, give us a comment. If you don't, well, comment as well, but just be polite. And thanks again, Daniel, for coming on today. It's really appreciated. A great conversation. Thank you.
Thank you, Adam. Thanks for great questions and, your willingness to have these sorts of conversations. More power to them.
Cheers.